On a snow-swept road, Jack was heading home. Then, his headlights caught something, a single cardboard box on the shoulder. His first instinct was to drive on. It was probably just trash. But something was wrong. In his old life as a cop, he'd learned to spot things that were out of place, and this box felt deliberate. He expected to find junk, maybe something broken. Instead, he found 6 tiny, freezing puppies huddled together against the cold. His surprise turned to shock when his fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked inside. It was a note, a desperate plea that turned a simple rescue into a mystery. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. The snow fell in heavy, silent waves, turning the world outside Jack's truck into a blur of white and gray. Headlights cut a lonely path through the storm on a road he'd driven 1,000 times, a road that now felt like it led to nowhere. The engine was a low rumble, the only sound besides the whisper of the tires on the fresh powder and the mournful howl of the wind. Inside the cab, the air was cold, but Jack didn't notice. A deeper chill had settled into his bones long ago, one that had nothing to do with the weather. He was heading home from a town he no longer felt a part of, to a house that was just a place to sleep. It was a routine of emptiness, a life lived in the quiet shadows of what used to be. Then his lights caught something on the shoulder, a dark square against the endless white. A cardboard box, half buried and abandoned to the cold. His first instinct was to keep driving. It was probably just trash, dumped by someone too lazy to find a bin. But something made him slow down, his foot easing off the gas. It was out of place, too deliberate. In his old life, a thing out of place was a thing to be investigated. That part of him, the cop, was buried deep, but it wasn't gone. He pulled the truck over, the tires crunching softly as they came to a stop. He left the engine running, its headlights carving 2 bright tunnels into the storm. As he stepped out, the wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and stinging his face with ice. Each step toward the box was a small battle against the gale. It was a simple cardboard box, soggy and buckling from the wet snow. There were no markings on it, nothing to hint at what was inside. Jack felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He'd seen too many bad things in his career. His mind, trained for the worst, began to list the grim possibilities. He reached down with a gloved hand and cautiously lifted one of the flaps. He expected nothing, maybe some old clothes or discarded junk. He did not expect to see a pair of dark, shining eyes looking back at him. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He opened the flap wider. Tucked inside a thin, worn blanket was a writhing pile of fur. Puppies. Tiny, shivering German Shepherd puppies. Their whimpers so faint, they were almost lost in the wind. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. One of them, bolder than the rest, tried to lift its head, its ears still floppy and oversized. It let out a tiny, hopeful cry. That sound broke through the ice that had encased Jack's heart for years. This wasn't a crime scene. It was something else entirely. It was a tragedy waiting to happen, one he had stumbled upon by chance. He looked around, up and down the empty, snow-swept road. There were no other cars, no footprints except his own. Who would do this? Who could leave these helpless creatures to freeze to death in a storm? The anger came first, hot and sharp, a feeling so strong it surprised him. But anger wouldn't keep them warm. He had to act. He knelt, the cold seeping through his jeans. Inside, a pile of shivering fur and pleading eyes met his. 6 of them, huddled together for warmth that was quickly fading. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something other than numb. Without a second thought, he carefully closed the flaps, lifted the box, and shielded it with his body against the fierce wind. He carried his fragile cargo back through the driving snow, each step careful and measured. The box felt impossibly light, yet it held the weight of 6 tiny, flickering lives. Back in the sterile quiet of his house, the only sounds were the soft whimpers of the puppies, now huddled in an old blanket by the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls of a home that hadn't seen this much life in years. Jack worked carefully, warming milk, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. He was clumsy at first, but a deep, protective instinct guided him. The puppies, sensing the warmth and safety, began to stir more purposefully. One by one, he fed them with a small dropper he'd found in a dusty first aid kit. Their tiny, eager mouths latched on, their soft whimpers turning into sounds of contentment. The sight of it, this simple act of survival, chipped away another layer of the coldness inside him. His living room was transformed. The neat, empty space was now a makeshift nursery, an old blanket, dragged out from a closet that held only memories, was their bed. The silence he had grown so used to was replaced by the gentle squeaks and sleepy sighs of new life. It was chaotic, and it was beautiful. He watched them for a long time, huddled together by the hearth. They were so small, so completely dependent. He had spent his life dealing with the consequences of brokenness and cruelty. But this was different. This was pure innocence, a small point of light in a world he had come to see as mostly dark. Eventually, he remembered the wet box, still sitting by the front door, leaking melted snow onto his floor. He picked it up, intending to throw it out before it ruined the wood. It was just a soggy piece of cardboard, the container for the precious things he'd rescued, nothing more. But as he went to collapse it, his fingers brushed against something tucked deep inside, hidden beneath the fold of the bottom flap. A small, folded piece of paper. It was cold, damp, and held a message. He carried it to the lamp by his chair, his heart beating a little faster. He carefully unfolded the damp paper. The ink was slightly blurred, but the handwriting was clear enough to read. It wasn't an explanation or an apology. It was a list of names. The names were written in a delicate, looping script: hope, faith, mercy, joy, comfort. Jack read each one slowly, the words feeling heavy and important. These weren't just names. They were prayers. They were virtues. They were everything he felt he had lost. And then a final name, set apart from the others, and my little warrior. He looked over at the pile of sleeping puppies. Which one was the warrior? Which was hope? He felt an unexpected connection to the person who had written this. Someone who had clearly loved these animals, enough to give them such powerful names before leaving them to an unknown fate. At the very bottom of the page, there were 4 final words. It wasn't a signature. It was an instruction, a plea that felt like a whisper from the storm itself, a mission he never asked for, but one that now seemed to be his. The note simply said, "Please find Sarah." The words lay on Jack's kitchen table like an unsolved case. Please find Sarah. It was more than a plea. It was a mission. Old instincts, buried for years under a mountain of grief, began to stir. He picked up the note, studying the shaky handwriting, and felt a forgotten sense of purpose return, a flicker of the man he used to be. The paper was simple, torn from a cheap notebook, but the pressure of the pen told a story. The writer was urgent, perhaps frail, but determined. He made a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him. As the dark liquid brewed, filling the quiet kitchen with its rich aroma, he laid out his evidence. It wasn't much. One soggy cardboard box, one worn blanket, and one cryptic note. He started with the box. It was a standard shipping box. No logos or addresses. Useless. Next, the blanket. It was old, faded plaid wool, worn soft with countless washings. He ran his hand over it, feeling the texture. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, a clean, gentle scent, like lavender soap. It was a blanket that had been cared for, loved even. He checked the edges for a tag, but it had been worn away to a few frayed threads. Another dead end. That left the note. He held it under the light again. The names themselves were a clue. Hope, faith, mercy, joy, comfort. These weren't random choices. They spoke of a person who held on to belief, who found solace in ideals bigger than themselves, and then, warrior. For the little one, the fighter. This Sarah, whoever she was, saw their spirits, not just their bodies. He sat back in his chair, the warm coffee mug in his hands, and let his mind work. This wasn't a crime of malice. Malice dumps a box and drives away without a thought. This was an act of desperation, a last resort. Someone who loved these puppies was forced to abandon them, but they did so with a prayer that they would be found by a kind soul. They left a trail, however faint, because they wanted to be found. The silence of the house was punctuated by the soft sounds from the living room. A tiny yip, the scuffling of little paws on the blanket. He walked back to the fireplace and stood watching them. They were all awake now, a clumsy, tumbling pile of black and tan fur. They explored their small world, bumping into each other, their movements uncoordinated and endearing. He felt a smile touch his lips, a rare and unfamiliar feeling. For 2 years, this house had been a tomb, a place where memories haunted the empty rooms. Now, it was filled with an innocent, demanding life force. It was overwhelming, and it was exactly what he didn't know he needed. His gaze drifted from one puppy to the next, trying to match them to the names on the list. The bold one who always found the milk first might be Joy. The quiet one who curled up in the corner could be Comfort. He found himself studying their tiny personalities, getting lost in their world. It was then that he noticed it. While 5 of the puppies were wrestling and exploring, one lay separated from the group. It was the smallest one, the one he'd instinctively thought of as the runt. It was curled into a tight ball, and unlike the others, it wasn't moving. Its sides were barely rising and falling. A cold dread washed over him, far colder than the winter storm. He knelt down, his heart pounding in his chest. He gently touched the tiny body. It was warm, but there was a limpness to it, a lack of the vibrant energy the others possessed. This had to be the one. The little warrior. And he was losing his fight. All thoughts of Sarah, of the note, of the mystery vanished from his mind. The investigation could wait. The abstract puzzle of a stranger's identity was nothing compared to the concrete, fragile life in front of him. He looked over at the pile of sleeping puppies. They were clues, yes, but they were also a responsibility. His eyes settled on the smallest one, who seemed to be breathing just a little too fast. The mission to find Sarah would have to wait. First, he had to make sure the little warrior survived the night. One puppy was smaller than the rest, his breathing shallow and weak. All through the long night, Jack sat with him, a single lamp pushing back the darkness, whispering words of encouragement as he coaxed drops of warm milk into the tiny mouth. The world shrank to the space around his armchair, to the rise and fall of a tiny chest. He had wrapped the puppy in a soft hand towel and held him close to his own body for warmth. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the minutes, then the hours. Each tick felt like a countdown. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a profound, snow-muffled silence. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the embers in the fireplace and the faint, labored breaths of the little creature in his hands. He remembered other vigils, other times he had waited through the long, dark hours, praying for a dawn that would bring good news. Most of the time, it hadn't. Loss had a familiar weight, and he felt its shadow creeping into the room now, threatening to claim this one tiny, insignificant life. But he refused to let it. "Come on, little guy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "You're a warrior. You have to fight." He gently stroked the puppy's head with his thumb, a gesture of tenderness that felt both foreign and deeply natural. He wasn't a cop on a case anymore. He wasn't a man hiding from his past. He was just a guardian, a protector of a life that weighed almost nothing in his hands, but felt as important as the whole world. Around 2 in the morning, the puppy began to shiver. A wave of panic seized Jack. He stood up, pacing the floor with the tiny bundle held securely against his chest. He added another log to the fire, coaxing the embers back to a gentle blaze. He refilled the dropper with warm milk, sweetened with a tiny speck of sugar for energy, a trick his grandfather had taught him for newborn lambs. He sat back down, his body aching with fatigue, and began the process again. A single drop on the puppy's lips, a hesitant, weak lick. Another drop. He worked with a patience he didn't know he possessed. He was focused with an intensity he hadn't felt since he'd worn a badge. This was his entire world now. He must have dozed off for a moment, his head lolling against the back of the armchair. He awoke with a start, a jolt of fear that he had failed. He looked down at the towel in his lap. The puppy was still. For a terrible, heart-stopping second, he thought it was over. But then a tiny pink tongue emerged and gave a slow, deliberate lick to his knuckle. Jack held his breath. The puppy stirred, stretching a minuscule leg. Its breathing was still shallow, but it was even, deeper. The shivering had stopped as the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, painting the snowy landscape in shades of blue and lavender. The tiny creature stirred again and gave a weak lick to Jack's finger. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled him, washed over Jack. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until it came out in a long, shaky sigh. He looked down at the little fighter, alive against all odds, and knew this was no longer just about a note. This was about honoring a promise he hadn't even known he'd made. A promise to a woman named Sarah. A promise to this tiny, resilient life. He had fought the darkness and, for the first time in a very long time, he had won. The little warrior was asleep, tucked into a box lined with Jack's softest sweater, his breathing now deep and steady. The other 5 puppies tumbled around him, a healthy, happy pile of fur. Seeing them safe, seeing the smallest one pull through, solidified something in Jack. He wasn't just their rescuer anymore, he was their advocate. He owed it to them, and to the mysterious Sarah, to see this through. But he couldn't do it alone. He looked around his quiet property. His nearest neighbor, Mrs. Gable, lived a quarter-mile down the road. He barely knew her, just a polite wave when they passed on the road. But she was kind-faced and always had a well-tended garden, and in his experience, that counted for something. Swallowing his pride and his instinct for isolation, he carefully loaded the 5 healthy puppies into a box and drove to her small cottage. He explained the situation, feeling the rustiness of a real conversation. To his surprise, she didn't hesitate, her eyes full of warmth and concern as she agreed to watch them for a few hours. With the puppies safe, Jack drove his truck into the small, familiar town of Northwood. The morning was bright and cold, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a brilliant, cloudless blue. Fresh snow lay thick and undisturbed, muffling the world in a beautiful silence. He felt like he was seeing it all for the first time. He wasn't a cop anymore, just a man with a photo on his phone and a strange story. His first stop was the veterinary clinic. A young woman in bright blue scrubs listened politely, but shook her head. "We haven't seen a new litter of German Shepherds in months," she said, her attention already drifting to the next appointment on her screen. "You could check with the county shelter, I suppose." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Next, he went to the general store on Main Street, picking up a bag of puppy food and a few other supplies. He showed the picture to the girl at the checkout, a teenager who just gave him a blank stare and a shrug. "Sorry, I don't know." He felt a familiar frustration creeping in. In his old job, he had authority, a badge that made people talk. Now, he was just a stranger asking questions, easily ignored. He was about to give up for the day when he remembered Miller's Feed and Seed, an old, dusty establishment on the edge of town that had been there forever. It smelled of grain, leather, and earth. The place was run by Earl Miller, a man as old and weathered as the building itself, who knew every farmer, rancher, and dog owner for 50 miles around. Jack found Earl in the back, hauling a 50-pound sack of feed with surprising ease. He waited until the old man was done, then approached. "Earl," he began, holding up his phone, "I've got a strange question for you." Earl squinted at the photo of the puppies, his expression unreadable. He took his time, humming to himself. "German Shepherd. Good-looking pups. Where'd you get 'em?" "Found them," Jack said simply, leaving out the details of the storm. "I'm trying to find their owner, a woman named Sarah." The old man's gaze sharpened. He looked from the phone to Jack, then back to the phone. "Well, he rasped, wiping his dusty hands on his apron. "They've got their mother's eyes." Jack's heart leaped. "You know them?" "I know the mother," Earl corrected. "That's Belle. I'd bet my last dollar on it. Belonged to Sarah Jenkins. A real sweet dog." The old man's face clouded over with a hint of sadness. "Where can I find her?" Jack asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "Sarah Jenkins?" Earl pointed with a dusty thumb toward the window. "She lives." "Well, lived in that little blue house up on Mill Road, the one on the hill. Haven't seen her around lately, though. Been a couple weeks, now that I think on it." Mill Road was a narrow, winding lane that climbed up out of the valley. The snow here was even deeper. His truck, the first vehicle to mark a path since the storm. The address led him to a small, neat house at the end of the gravel lane, set against a backdrop of tall pine trees. It stood silent and watchful, a wreath of dried hydrangeas still hanging on the front door, their purple hues faded by the sun. He parked the truck and got out, the silence absolute. There was no smoke from the chimney, no car in the drive. A tidy garden, now sleeping under a blanket of snow, was bordered by smooth river stones. Weeds were just beginning to push through the edges, a small sign of recent neglect in an otherwise lovingly tended space. This was the home of someone who cared. He walked up the shoveled stone path to the front porch, his old instincts telling him to be observant. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. He waited, then knocked again, louder this time. There was no answer. He knew with the certainty that settled deep in his gut that no one was home. Drawn by a need to understand, he moved to the side of the house and peered through a large living room window. The glass was cold against his forehead. Inside, the house was immaculate. A handmade quilt was folded neatly over the back of an armchair. Beside it, on a small table, sat a teacup and a book left open, its pages held in place by a pair of reading glasses. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a moment and never came back. On the fireplace mantel, amongst a collection of small porcelain birds, was a framed photograph. It was an older photo, slightly faded, of a smiling woman with kind eyes and silver hair. In her lap was a beautiful German shepherd, Belle, he presumed, who looked at the camera with an expression of pure, unwavering loyalty. This was Sarah. He felt like he was looking at a ghost. A profound sadness washed over him. This quiet, orderly house, frozen in time, felt so much like his own. A place where a life had simply stopped. He felt a kinship with this woman he'd never met, a shared understanding of a world suddenly gone silent. This wasn't just a house, it was a shrine to a life that had been full. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold sting of a dead end. He had a name and a face, but he was no closer to understanding why her puppies had been left in a box on the side of the road. This was just a house now, a shell holding nothing but memories that weren't his. He turned to leave, the crunch of his boots on the gravel sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. That's when a soft voice cut through the stillness, making him jump. "You're looking for Sarah, aren't you?" Jack turned. The door of the house next door, nearly hidden by a thicket of fir trees, had creaked open. An elderly woman with kind, worried eyes stood on her porch, wrapped in a thick shawl. She had been watching him, her expression not one of suspicion, but of weary expectation, as if she'd been waiting for someone like him to finally arrive. Jack turned fully to face the woman. She was small and frail-looking, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "I am." "I thought so," she said, giving a sad, knowing nod. "I'm Martha Gable. I live next door. Please, come in out of the cold. You look frozen." He hesitated for a moment, his ingrained reluctance to engage warring with his need for answers. But the genuine warmth in her invitation won out. He followed her up the steps and into a cozy, cluttered kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. She gestured for him to sit at a small wooden table while she bustled around, pouring 2 mugs of hot coffee. "I saw your truck pull up," she began, setting a steaming mug in front of him. "You're the first person who's come looking for her. I've been so worried." "I found her puppies," Jack said, deciding the direct truth was the best approach. "They were left on the side of the road during the storm." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh, that dear woman! That's what she was afraid of. Oh, the poor soul!" Tears welled in her eyes. She loved those little ones more than anything. Jack waited patiently as she composed herself, taking a sip of the hot, sweet coffee. He could see she was bursting with the story, a story she'd had no one to tell. "Sarah was my best friend," Martha began, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been neighbors for 30 years. Her dog Belle was her whole world after her husband passed. When Belle had those puppies, well, it was like a light came back on in Sarah's life. She was so happy, planning everything, knitting them little blankets." She paused, looking out the window toward Sarah's silent house. But she was sick. Her heart. She tried to hide how bad it was, but I could see her getting weaker. A few weeks ago, Belle passed away in her sleep. Old age. It broke Sarah's heart, but it made her even more determined to see those puppies were safe. "What happened to Sarah?" Jack asked gently. "Her health took a bad turn right after Belle died," Martha said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Her nephew, a man from the city she hadn't seen in years, came to help. He convinced her she needed to go into a hospice facility to get her strength back. Martha's lips thinned. She didn't want to go. She was terrified of leaving the puppies. He promised her he would find good, local homes for every single one of them. He swore he would. The pieces clicked into place for Jack, the out-of-town relative, the broken promise, the act of callous convenience disguised as help. The anger he'd felt on the roadside returned, sharper now that it had a face, however vague. She knew, Martha continued, wiping a tear from her cheek. I think, deep down, she knew she couldn't trust him. She knew she wasn't coming home. She looked at Jack, her gaze steady and full of a silent request. She made me promise something before the ambulance took her away. The old woman stood and disappeared into her living room for a moment. Jack could hear the sound of a drawer opening and closing. She returned holding a worn, sealed envelope. The paper was cream-colored, and Sarah's name was written on the front in that same shaky, looping script from the note in the box. She held it out to him. She said, "Martha, if I don't come back, someone will eventually come looking for my treasures. Someone with a good heart." She made me promise I would give this to that person. Martha's eyes met his, and in them he saw that she had decided he was the one Sarah had been waiting for. Jack took the envelope. It felt warm from her hands, and heavier than a single piece of paper should. His hands, which had held weapons and steered patrol cars through high-speed chases, trembled slightly as he took it. He felt like he was holding something sacred, a final confession or a last will and testament. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky. He didn't open it there, in front of the grieving neighbor. It felt too personal, a final communication from a woman he was only just getting to know. He thanked Martha for the coffee and the story, promising he would make sure the puppies were safe. As he left, she placed a hand on his arm. "You're a good man for stopping," she said. "You've answered a prayer." Back in his truck, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty, but filled with the presence of Sarah Jenkins and her final, desperate hope. He drove home slowly, the letter resting on the passenger seat beside him. The world looked sharper, the snow brighter, the sky a deeper blue. Once inside his own quiet house, he checked on the puppies. The little warrior was awake, trying to wrestle with one of his larger brothers. Seeing him thriving, a tiny spark of defiance and life, gave Jack the courage to finally read the letter. He sat down in his armchair by the fire, the same chair where he'd held the vigil, and carefully broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper was filled with that same shaky but elegant handwriting. "To the stranger who found my treasures," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and my greatest fear has come true. I am so sorry you found my puppies this way. Please know, leaving them was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. Their mother, my sweet Belle, was my sunlight. These puppies were her final gift to me, a last promise of life and joy. I am not well. My time is short, and I must go to a place where I can no longer care for them. I asked my nephew for help, but I fear the task is a burden to him. I fear he will not understand that they are not just animals, but 6 little pieces of a loving heart. Their names are Hope, Faith, Mercy, Joy, Comfort, and my little warrior, who I know is the smallest but has the strongest spirit. I am not a wealthy woman. I have nothing to offer you for your kindness except my deepest gratitude. All I ask is that you do what my nephew would not. Please, find them homes where they will be cherished. Find them families who will see the light in them as I do. Let them bring the joy to others that their mother brought to me. Do not be sad for me. I have lived a good life, full of love. My only regret is not being able to see them grow. Thank you. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for caring. Yours in faith, Sarah Jenkins. Jack folded the letter carefully, the fragile paper holding the weight of a life's final prayer. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. There was no crime here, no villain to chase in the traditional sense. There was only a woman named Sarah who had loved her dog, cherished her puppies, and placed her last ounce of faith in the kindness of a stranger. He looked from the letter to the sleeping puppies by the fire. He wasn't an investigator anymore. He was the keeper of a promise. He had found Sarah, not in person, but in her words and in the legacy she had entrusted to a snowy road, hoping for a miracle. And now it was up to him to complete it. The story of Sarah and her puppies spread through the town like a gentle fire. It started with Mrs. Pation, Gable, who, after Jack told her what was in the letter, made it her personal mission. She called the pastor at her church, who mentioned it during his Sunday announcements. Earl, at the feed store, put a small handwritten sign up by his register with a picture of the puppies, Sarah Jenkins's legacy. Loving homes needed. The story resonated with the simple, profound decency of the small town. It wasn't just about puppies needing a home. It was about honoring a neighbor's last wish. Soon, Jack's quiet, isolated life was turned upside down. His phone, usually silent for days at a time, began to ring. Cars he didn't recognize started pulling into his long driveway. He found himself talking to more people in 3 days than he had in the past 2 years. At first, it was jarring, an intrusion into the carefully constructed fortress of his solitude. But as he met the families, he saw not just curiosity, but genuine compassion in their eyes. He became a reluctant but meticulous guardian of Sarah's legacy. He didn't just hand the puppies over to the first person who asked. He interviewed each family, asking questions about their homes, their yards, and their understanding of what a dog truly needs. He was looking for a specific quality, the same kindness and love that radiated from Sarah's letter. He was looking for people who understood that this was more than just an adoption. It was the acceptance of a sacred trust. His quiet house was filled with the warm, happy chatter of families. He watched as a young couple with their first home fell in love with Mercy, the gentle puppy who loved to cuddle. They promised her a big, soft bed right next to theirs. A retired school teacher, a widow herself, chose comfort, saying his quiet companionship was exactly what she needed. She told Jack she would read to him every evening. He watched, a quiet guardian, as a little girl with bright pigtails gently hugged the puppy Sarah had named Hope. The girl's parents explained that she'd been asking for a dog for years, and they had been waiting for the right one. As they held Hope, their faces lit up with a joy so pure it made Jack's chest ache in a good way. One by one, they left his care, carried away in the arms of loving families. He saw Joy, the most boisterous and playful of the bunch, leap excitedly into the truck of a farmer who promised her a life of open fields and creeks to splash in. Faith went home with the pastor's family, who had 3 gentle children who promised to teach her how to play fetch. With each departure, Jack felt a pang of loss, but it was overshadowed by a deep, fulfilling sense of rightness. He was completing the circle. Finally, only one was left. He was sitting quietly by Jack's boots, looking up at him with intelligent, trusting eyes. The little warrior. Several families had asked about him, drawn to his story of survival. But Jack had found himself making excuses, saying he wasn't quite ready yet, that he was still a little fragile. He was lying, and he knew it. The truth was simple. The little warrior wasn't waiting for a new home. He was already in it. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A peaceful one. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the lingering warmth of happy voices and the soft echoes of a promise fulfilled. As the sun rose the next morning, casting a golden light over the fresh snow, Jack clipped a leash onto the collar of the little warrior, now strong and steady on his paws. The puppy, whom Jack had started calling Leo, danced around his feet, his tail a blur of happy motion. Together they walked out the front door, leaving the shadows of the past behind them. The air was crisp and clean, and the world seemed new, washed clean by the storm. Leo bounded ahead, his nose buried in the snow, discovering the world with an unbridled joy that was infectious. Jack watched him, a real, genuine smile on his face. For 2 years, mornings had been the hardest. They were a reminder of another day to get through, another day haunted by what he had lost. But this morning, standing on his porch with a leash in his hand and a small, energetic dog waiting for him, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. They walked the perimeter of his property, Leo darting back and forth, investigating every scent and shadow. Jack felt a sense of purpose in the simple act of the walk. He wasn't just a man walking his dog. He was a guardian, a companion. The small acts of care, filling a food bowl, clipping on a leash, offering a reassuring pat, were slowly rebuilding the broken parts of him. The puppies had needed him to survive, but he was beginning to realize he had needed them just as much. They reached the top of a small hill that overlooked the valley. The town of Northwood was nestled below, a plume of smoke rising from a chimney here and there. He could see Sarah's little blue house, quiet and still, but it no longer looked sad to him. It looked peaceful. He had fulfilled her wish. Her legacy of love was now scattered throughout the town, warming 6 different homes, 6 different families. He knelt down and scratched Leo behind the ears, earning a happy yip and a wet lick on the chin. The little box found in the snow had held more than just puppies. It had held redemption. It had held a second chance, not just for them, but for him. Looking out at the sun-drenched landscape, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude, a quiet grace that had filled the empty spaces in his home and in his heart. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter, replaced by the gentle tug of a leash and the steady, comforting presence of the little warrior at his side. He was no longer a man heading nowhere. He was a man heading home.